All right, so again, please check your apps for the schedule for the day. We have back-to-back sessions today until 12 p.m. After 12 p.m., we have closing remarks and feedback. Please do not leave without providing us feedback on the conference. We'll find a way to get it, either just yell it out or put it on a wall somewhere. And then we have press conference from 12:30 to 1. So please stick around for press conference as well. Those of you who are on the Board of Governors of AAUC, after 3 p.m. or from 3 to 6, it's the Board of Governors meeting somewhere in this facility, which SK knows about. Okay, so without further delay, let me get started with the agenda for the day. We have a keynote coming up from none other than Mr. Aziz Haniffa, whom I have introduced and others have done so very eloquently yesterday. But the only thing that I would like to stress upon is Aziz's new venture, which he's a co-founder of, and that's called Desi Max TV. You can check out Desi Max TV on desimaxtv.com. Aziz, we're ready for you.
Thank you very much, Rajiv, for the introduction. And thanks for being such a driving force and a real go-getter and getting everything in ship-shop time. I think we have exceeded all limitations in terms of Indian time, Asian time, etc. This is amazing. I think the time lapse has been hardly... Yeah. And thank you, Dr. Loh, for inviting me to this wonderful conference, and also the fact that you have been able to corral various groups, ethnic organizations into this organization and make it into a real pan-Asian American outfit. And I think you told us that the first conference was held in Alaska. And, I guess when people agreed to come to Alaska, that showed that they were very serious and their commitment, the fact that they were willing to come to Alaska. And then I think that was a good strategic move by you to see who are the people who are really serious. And I am so glad to see that the Indian American and South Asian American community, which used to be a little removed from the East Asian community, and the fact that these communities haven't gotten together, even though they have been in the country for 30, 40 years, have gotten together. And I think it was a very good strategic move that you were able to bring in some really good Indian American stalwarts whom I've covered and known for many, many years, like Angela Anand, Piyush Bhai, Piyush Agrawal, Niraj Bakshi, Thomas Abraham. And this has also given me an opportunity to meet with some very close and dear friends I'm meeting after years. Ambassador Islam Siddiqui, a brilliant agricultural scientist whom I covered for over 20 years when he was in the Clinton and Obama administrations. And then friends like Amrit Bhandari, whom I was meeting after quite some time. And also new friends and lots of new friends and among the vibrant Asian American community. I know that you had assigned me to speak about the importance of an independent media. And before getting onto that, let me give a little background of myself and put in context why that is important in terms of speaking about an Indian and independent media. All of us immigrants have had some serendipitous unique experience in the United States, and how they came to be in the United States and how life changed for them in the United States. Now, India Abroad, we used to have sort of a pipeline. The newspaper I worked for 40 years, nearly 40 years, called India Abroad, which was probably one of the first Asian newspapers that was established as an American newspaper, an American ethnic newspaper in the US in 1970. And unfortunately, its untimely demise after 50 years because the internet had come, Facebook had become the universal media, and even venerable mainstream newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune, and all had gone bankrupt. And it was only a few like the New York Times and the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times that have survived. Why I say how I entered to be a rookie reporter at India Abroad, followed by executive editor at India Abroad, was serendipitous. Was every time I was this active journalist covering, mainstream issues, covering the Congress, the White House, the State Department, etc. Because guys would then say, "Where in India are you from?" And I would say, "No, I am not from India, I am from Sri Lanka." Then they would say, "How the heck did you become the editor of India Abroad and keep covering issues much better than all the Indian correspondents who have been based here? Whether it be the Times of India, the Hindustan Times, and all these other major newspapers which had their own correspondents where they paid a lot of money for these guys. And some of them, of course, would sort of rewrite what the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal wrote about." And why I say it's serendipitous was Gopal Raju had the vision to start an Indian newspaper in the 70s, and it was essentially to keep the community informed of what was going on in India. Because at that time there was no internet. Only news you got probably came days after. Now it's, of course, within seconds. This was a way, there were a few Indian immigrants who were there at the time in the Washington area, and also around the country, and to keep them informed of what was going on in India. So he had already had the newspaper for about 10 years when I joined in the mid-1980s. And he had a mutual Sri Lankan friend who worked for the United Nations. And he was having a New York Times copy editor who was his correspondent, sort of a freelancer who was moonlighting for him. And, he was he was a newspaper publisher and a very fearless newspaper publisher and owner. But he was also what in India they call a banya businessman, A very, banya means a real shrewd, ruthless businessman. And he found that this New York Times guy was just rewriting press releases that he got. And he wanted a young guy who could really hustle, who could really cover the Congress, who could cover the White House and all that kind of thing. And even though maintaining the ethnic identity of India Abroad as a South Asian newspaper and an Indian newspaper, he wanted to get out into the mainstream and cover mainstream issues. And this meant covering US-India relations, interviewing senators, congressmen, prime ministers, presidents, etc., and also covering the growing Indian American community. So this is how this Sri Lankan guy, through a mutual friend, and mutual friend had said, Aziz is just finishing up his graduate studies in Washington. He used to be a journalist for a few years in Sri Lanka. Why don't you? So I took the Amtrak to New York, met with him, met with his editor, and then he said, "You're hired." And then, of course, he was right when he said, I want a real guy who can hustle and be a real hustler in getting the news. I started writing so many stories that the Banya businessman quickly told his accountant, "Put the fellow on salary because it's much cheaper than paying him by the word." So I was earning less because he put me on salary. And then, of course, it was a great ride. And after a few years, India Abroad, and with the advent of the internet and the computerization that has taken place, and mostly with the burgeoning Indian American community, which very quickly, like the Asian American community, started punching way beyond its weight in terms of, the community activism and everything else, the newspaper went from being sort of a India newspaper to Indian American newspaper, because it was essentially an American newspaper, started and owned by an American publisher who had started to write about US-India news to keep people informed. And also the Indian American community was growing. And the first brand of people that we were covering were the Indian American doctors who had come here. because this was the time they called it the brain drain in South Asia. A lot of professionals, mostly doctors, came here because the Vietnam War had taken the lives of over 50,000 Americans, including a lot of doctors who were also posted in Vietnam, and they needed a lot of doctors here. And that's how a lot of South Asian doctors came to the US and became sort of the brand of what the community was all about. And when you say that they needed doctors, they needed them real bad and in a real hurry. And there were virtually hospital administrators and others virtually coming to the airport with a green card in hand, unlike the 100 years people have to wait for green cards now. So this was the first brand, and then followed by the evolution of the techies, the hoteliers, the professionals, etc. And this was what we were covering essentially. And at that time, the Indian American community was essentially, like all of the other Asian American communities, a very passive community. The political involvement was very minimal. At most, they would maybe have a small fundraiser and donate to some campaigns of congressmen, senators, and they would be very happy with just a few photo ops or photo opportunities where they could then print the picture and have it in their living room. They were quite happy, and that very much like Meili was describing to us in our opening keynote yesterday, that there was really no activism in terms of outcomes, saying that these are the issues that are of concern to us, and this is what we need to do. So anyway, in terms of the independent journalism, I was very fortunate to have an ethnic owner and an ethnic publisher who was willing to give me the independence to write what I want, to ask the tough questions out of the senators and congressmen and administration officials and other officials and even prime ministers and presidents I interviewed, because most times one of the fallacies and one of the problems of being with a small newspaper is that usually the owner has a bias or a prejudice, or he wants to promote himself through his newspaper, which unfortunately seems to have happened now because the media has gone into their own corners with their own agenda and their own bubbles. And the independence has really diminished and dissipated in today's world. And with social media and with smartphones, everybody has become a journalist. You got your smartphone, you start taping things, and there are advantages to that also. There are so many issues that happen. If not for someone with a smartphone recording what happened, probably some of the law enforcement abuse and other things that have happened and various other issues may not have come to the fore. But what has happened is, unfortunately, there has been everybody going to their own corners, into their own bubbles, and finding that this kind of bias towards one party or the other, or one individual or the other, has taken away from independent journalism, even in the mainstream. And this is much more prevalent in the ethnic media, because you usually get like an affluent person or an entrepreneur or someone who wants to promote himself or aggrandize himself, starting a newspaper and saying, no, you can't write about anything negative about this guy, write positive things about someone else. And what happens is, the community doesn't really know the true picture when that happens. So Gopal Raju gave me the independence to write about all these things. And mind you, this was the time when I started, was the time of the Cold War, where US and India didn't have a good relationship at all. India was considered as sort of a surrogate of the erstwhile Soviet Union, and Pakistan was considered the ally of the United States. So a lot of the issues in India, the the Pakistan-India rivalry, the issues that of the Cold War were being played out in terms of the relationship. And today, the US-India relationship is amazing. It's on such a strategic level that people probably don't know the bad old days. Some of even the diplomats at the Indian government and who are based in Washington have absolutely no idea of the bad old days when India would be taken to task in Congress. with all kinds of amendments, all kinds of resolutions, human rights resolutions, etc., which there was a congressman called Dan Burton. And it was also interesting because there were also issues of Kashmir, of Punjab, where there were a secessionist movement called the Council for Khalistan. And so they had their own lobbies, which they would go and meet with the congressmen and senators, etc. And it was very interesting because you would get the pro-India lobby that would go and meet with the congressman, and they would also meet with this Council of Khalistan, the Kashmiri lobby, etc. And then when I go to interview this congressman, the guy who obviously had to be shown where India was on the map those days, would say, Aziz, what's going on? I just had a group coming and talking really good about India. And then 2 other groups came and attacked India, and they were Indians too, So this was the kind of thing I had to put in perspective in terms of the reportage that I was doing. And I think having a publisher, a fearless publisher like Gopal Raju, who was able to tell me that I could do this kind of thing without taking an angle or the other, either a very pro-India government stand or bias towards the other groups that were accusing India of human rights violations, etc. Just report the facts in terms of what I was writing about. And of course, we had our opinion makers, they could write their opinion, a liberal column, a conservative column, etc. But at least in terms of the reportage, he didn't come and tell me, you better write this way so that, we don't get the Indian government on our back, or write this way so that we don't have our fellow Indian Americans here taking us to task. And this was also the time of the emergency in India, where former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had imposed an emergency and press censorship, and it was a bad time in India at the time. And there were so many exiles of Indian opposition leaders, etc., who were living in the US at the time, or had even come to the US, because they knew if they go back, they could be jailed and persecuted and all kinds of things. And sometimes we would carry their opinion pieces also. And at the time, the Indian ambassador to the US had come and told Gopal Raju, don't let these guys write for you like this, I can make you a very rich man if you don't do that, And he had just told the guy, I don't want to use the name that, use the word that he used to tell the guy to get out of there. And he said, I'm an American publisher, and this is an American newspaper, and we'll write exactly what we want. And then he had to file a lawsuit, because he also had a very successful travel agency, which he had used from his student days at the University of Michigan, where he did his graduate studies. And Air India, he was an agent for Air India, and that they had stopped millions of dollars of commissions that were owed him overnight because he refused to go with what they were saying. So for an ethnic publisher, this was quite amazing, because there were so many other ethnic newspapers that were cropping up, but in the sense that no one had taken a stand like this. And that became a cause célèbre in terms of a newspaper media thing, that you had almost all the other newspapers, the mainstream newspapers, featuring this. And there is a magazine called Editor and Publisher, which would publish things on the media. And they had a cover story. And in fact, that case is a case study where people have even done sort of PhDs on. So India Abroad started having a reputation, and with that, I think, the subscription grew so much, the circulation grew, and then apart from the doctors, the technology crowd had also gone. So the revenue streams are also coming in, because now the Indian entrepreneurs, the doctors, etc., and we also had a very successful marriage classified section, which used to bring several $100s every week. And in fact, there would be times when I would go to a hotel to cover a conference or something, and there would be an Indian lady, someone checking me in, and would say, what are you doing? I say, I'm with India Abroad, I come here for a conference. And they say, India Abroad, I got married through India Abroad, because they would match them, and there were things like, even abbreviations like GCH, meaning green card holders, ISO, in search of, and then they would even say that Sikhs, the Sardars who have the big beard and everything else, they would even say clean-shaven Sikhs, in search of. So the revenue streams were coming because the community was growing. And I think there was such a dearth of really good independent news. And I think this is something that's very important in the subject matter that you told me to cover, the importance of an independent media. Because the media is considered the fourth estate, informally considered the fourth estate after the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. So I think that's extremely important, and I think the fact that an ethnic newspaper could report on the community, and also a community with all its flaws, with all its warts, and also its successes and achievements, I think helped us grow the circulation, bring in a lot of revenue in terms of advertisements from the corporates and other Indian industrialists and others who are doing very well. And it was a great, great ride for 30, 35, 38 years. And I was able to grow with the newspaper, and one of the most memorable trips I took was with President Clinton in March 2000, where Ambassador Islam Siddiqui was one of only 2 Indian Americans who were on Air Force One. And this helped to establish my newspaper as a newspaper of record in terms of the coverage that we're doing in terms of the community. And we also started broad-basing it in terms of not exclusively the Indian American community, but also sort of pan-Asian to a certain extent, as much as we could, in terms of other Asian communities, especially the South Asian community, in terms of Sri Lanka, in terms of Pakistan, in terms of other countries in the region, from even Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, etc. So that's my background, and what I want to do is I'll speak for a few more minutes because I'd like to open it out for questions in terms of how the Asian American Unity Coalition can use and make use of the independent mainstream media. I think it's important where we have to get our story out in terms of even a conference like this. Even though we may not have a huge crowd of people who have come, make sure that everyone is able to get the message out that there has been this kind of pan-Asian unity coalition which has been working towards affecting the futures of not just ourselves but also coming generations and the future generations. And I think what is important is the fact that, we have to be very honest and candid in terms of what we do, because all of us have our own issues in terms of communities. The South Asians have so many different groups among themselves, the Chinese Americans, the Japanese Americans, the Korean Americans, and all other Asian groups have enough and more issues. But I think, like Meli made such a great point, that there are issues where we can really unite on, especially in contemporary times, the hate crimes against Asian Americans. Like I was telling Rajiv the other day, just when we thought we had made it and arrived, the pandemic brought some of the worst in the bigotry, xenophobia, Islamophobia, Hinduphobia, etc. against Asian. And like Professor Jung was talking about, what was most unfortunate and just horrific was the number of elderly Asian Americans who are being subjected to these hate crimes. So I think those are outcomes we can work collectively, even as we maintain our identity and our individuality as people from one country or the other, or from one region and the other, because that is extremely important in terms of what we do in terms of, alleviating situations of hate crimes, then issues we have on immigration, whatever issues we may have on hardcore issues like abortion and things like that, which may not affect us as much as this generation, but the Gen Zs and the millennials and others who follow is going to have an impact on them, because we are into almost our 4th generation here, and we don't want our children and their children to be asked, where do you come from? Why don't you go back home? We have to make sure that we can collectively make the independence and also show to Americans that we are Americans today. And like Ambassador Siddiqui said yesterday, I think it's not just a melting point, that we are part of a mosaic of various colors and hues, and we are all part of America, and we abide by the American Constitution and all the other rules of law that are subject to each and every American, and that we demand equality in terms of what we have to do. And in terms of a few issues where I think we probably have to use the template of the Jewish American community, the African American community, in terms of getting our word out, where we write letters to the editor, we write columns, we do issues like that to make sure that our voice is heard. Because some of the other communities, like the African American community and others, have issues that have been very Americans from his days of America's birth. But we are new immigrants, and we are facing the issues that they faced. So I think we have to get the word out. And there are today a lot of Asian American journalists, unlike when I started, who work in mainstream newspapers, from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, etc. And while they justifiably don't want to be pigeonholed into writing stories about just the Asian Americans, if we have friends who know some of them, we should talk to them, because they can always put us on to people who do these issues, who cover these issues, so that we can get some prominence. And also, when there are conferences, and when there is a unity conference like this, and when there are issues of hate crimes and other issues that affect us, I think we should quickly get a press release out and say that AAUC condemns such a hate crime, and we stand in solidarity with the group that has been affected. I think that's very important, because sometimes we say, hey, it didn't happen to us, or it will never happen to us, till it really reality hits, and it comes back to haunt you too. So I think that's important. And I think cultivating and even press releases, you follow up. Sometimes, I remember we would get tons and tons of press releases. But if you have some follow-up where somebody calls and says, we sent you a press release like this, and like I said, if we have someone who knows that, a journalist who works for a mainstream paper, and to make sure that once a story is written, there is a lot of follow-up. In fact, one of the worst hate crimes that has happened, and if you read the Washington Post or just Google it, was Pramila Jayapal, who was getting the Dalit Singh's award yesterday, who couldn't make it. And I have a strong feeling one of the reasons she didn't make it was because there has been a lot of hate, male hate, anger against. And the Washington Post had this comprehensive story 3 days ago. Please Google it and read it, about how someone in the neighborhood had been driving past with a gun, shooting the gun in the air, shouting profanities against her, which had just seen what kind of bigotry and xenophobia has been affected against Asian American, legislators and people who don't agree with one party or the other. So it's not something exclusive to just. And then, like Suhag mentioned the other day about the hate crimes against Indian Americans, and this is something that has to be we must unite over, and all organizations make sure that we don't simply ignore it because it didn't happen to our community or the other, and be in solidarity with other communities. So I think I'll stop there, and I would really like you all. We can have an interactive session in terms of Q&A, where you all can talk about my experience as a journalist and how best to get the message out. So I'm open to questions.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to tell you that you gave a very excellent perspective and a very excellent review on the history, how it got developed, and your own India Abroad newspaper, as well as your involvement. Just wanted to make a comment. After that, I have two questions. One is, see, I grew with India Abroad because I was there from 70s, and I was a community activist in New York City, Manhattan. Yes. and we had to deal with Gopal Raju many times.
Yeah.
Even in financial terms also, giving advertisements and things like that. So, but he was very independent, and in fact, you guys were so independent, some sections of the Indian community and Indian missions were considered you as anti-India.
Yes, yes.
In fact, that is okay. You did a good job.
Yeah. In fact, a quick interjection there was, I would get angry replies from both the Indian government and the Pakistani government, because that was the time we were writing about the India-Pakistan issues and the US reaction to it. So I used to be quite happy because both sides were blaming me. That meant that I was doing something right.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about the growth of the Indian community.
Yeah.
You said the medical doctors came. But actually the biggest group started coming was students after 1965.
Yes.
All the top Indian Institute of Technologies and Engineering schools, they're all top level. Out of 90% they used to come here.
Yeah.
So yesterday there was a speaker who was saying, how come Indian Americans were successful in corporate America? It was because these people came from that time onwards, and it followed. Yeah. And they were top-notch people, I would say, from the world to come, and that's why they were successful. But that was the biggest group.
Yes.
The students coming, settling, like Gopal Raju, who came,
who
like me.
Came as a student,
Yeah,
University of Michigan to do his graduate work,
But what I have seen that in the media right now, I mean, I keep close touch with all media, Indian media, and mainstream media also in our local community. What I found after India Abroad was closed down, I know about more than 6 or 7 of them started their own cottage industry of publication online. So it has become like a large number of publications. I don't know how effective they are, but we reach out. Or any news to be given, they carry it. Because all you need is a desktop computer and a constant contact or MailChimp, so they get it out to the people. So they don't have enough staff. Sometimes on their own. So you send a good press release, they will copy it and send in a photograph. But my question comes to you now is, see, when we were doing in the 70s an India Day parade, whether it is or a Chinese New Year and all, even New York Times comes and covers it. Okay. But what I see is that now to reach out to New York Times or mainstream media has become extremely difficult. You said you prepare a press release and send out. But say, for example, we may have, this is a conference, AAUC. It's a national issues, many things. I could reach it out to the ethnic community, but not in the mainstream community. That has become a big issue. To get an article in New York Times or Washington Post for community groups, it has become very tough. Any thoughts on how we effectively reach them out and get it out to them?
First, your point is very well taken about the advent of Indian students. Today, and for the past 10 years or more, the Indians have been number one in terms of students in the US. Sometimes China beats India, but it's been a battle between China and India in terms of students. Average at least 100,000 a year. And the fact that they came early, and a lot of them were from IIT with the Indian Institutes of Technology. And this is something else that you all may like to Google. It was an interview for 60 minutes done by Leslie Stahl of Narayan Murthy, who was considered the Bill Gates of India. And IIT is so competitive that Harvard, Yale, and Stanford and all these universities love to have IIT students from the Indian Institutes of Technology. And Leslie Stahl was, and that's one of the few things where it's strictly on merit. You may have all the money in the world, or you may be the most powerful parent. You can't get your son into IIT. And Leslie Stahl was interviewing Narayan Murthy, and she said, so what about your son? Did he get into IIT? He said, no, he couldn't get into IIT. But then what is he doing now? Leslie Stahl asked. And he said, I think he went to Cornell or someplace, So you can just imagine, Cornell was considered like nothing compared to the IIT. But in terms of your point, I think one of the problems also in covering ethnic communities and all that is the fact that even newspapers, the mainstream newspapers have been facing this crunch, both in terms of revenue streams, because everything has gone digital, and you don't have the kind of revenue streams that they had with digital, even though the New York Times and all that can boast of a bigger circulation because they have a terrific digital presence, and the Washington Post. So unfortunately, like when you are having a conference in Vegas, and you're really having issues that matter to the community which are being discussed. You know, you would love to get the issue out, but they don't have the correspondence they once had. Like, otherwise they would have had a correspondent in Vegas, they have huge foreign bureaus, etc. But I think, fortunately, and then what happens is they do long features. And, you know, unfortunately, issues like economic development, alleviation of poverty in India are not sexy issues compared to some child bride burning or some other huge issue, which makes for, it's considered quote-unquote sexy issues, you know. But when economic development or alleviation of poverty, or the fact that, you know, India is having all kinds of problems while at the same time having this dichotomy of being a nuclear power and advancing in science, etc., makes for great long-form stories. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen because one is they have closed down a lot of bureaus, and they have one bureau guy in Delhi maybe for all of South Asia. And then they also, you know, these days with digital, everything is about likes and how many likes you get, how many page views you get, which is in a way very, very unfortunate. And that's why I still am very saddened about the fact that India Abroad in its 50th year had to close down the door, because just before it closed down, I went around and met some of the largest Indian entrepreneurs, billionaires, etc. And I said, don't think of this as a business proposition. I know things are bad, circulation is bad, India Abroad is not making and having the revenue streams that we had. But this is an institution. And the fact that India Abroad was read in the White House, in Congress, in the State Department, etc. And I would have mainstream journalists from these newspapers calling me because they had been told by someone, why don't you talk to Aziz about what this issue is or something. Or congressmen like Stephen Solas, whom you knew, and who was a great India supporter, would say, I still remember this Wall Street guy called John Solomon, who called me and said, Steve Solas said to talk to you to get some perspective about what's happening. So that was unfortunate, because I just think if it was the Jewish American community, if they had an institution like India Abroad, they would have never let it fail. They would have never asked for bottom line figures and what the burn rate was or how many staff we can cut, etc. But these were some of the things that some of these billionaire Indians were asking me. So I said, don't think of it. So in that sense, I know it's very tough to get stuff into. But the idea is, that's why I say it's good to, if you know of someone who knows a mainstream journalist with a newspaper like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, etc., try to tap into them and ask them if they know that something like this is happening, that the issue like this is happening, and to make sure that they also get all sides. Because sometimes, and Suhag is very familiar with this, you know, you would find some bias against something, and the first one who gets it, you know, make sure that all these sides can be incorporated into a story so that people get a good perspective. And then, and this is another reason why a very powerful ethnic newspaper is needed, because most times they would do one story on it and that's it. There is not much follow-up, etc. But when you had a paper like India Abroad or other Asian papers, which I'm sure have been around for a while, they keep at it. They keep following it up. And then they can say that there has been either a negative impact, a consequence, or a positive consequence, which I think is very important. So the idea is, I know it can be frustrating, you know, when you send a press release or you send a story idea or something and it doesn't even get to first base. But I think the thing is to keep on trying till hopefully you hit a home run.
All right, so we have 2 more questions, but only 10 minutes.
Aziz, can I have it? Aziz, you have been witness to history, and thank you for your presentation here.
Thank you.
And you referred to in your talk the Cold War and the relationship between India and US. There was another turning point which happened in 1998, and that was the second nuclear explosion. I happened to be in New Delhi on a trade mission, and that day when explosion took place, in the atmosphere in the American embassy went down from euphoria to something like this.
Absolutely.
So that evening, the ambassador had a reception in my honor, and many of the Indian officials who were supposed to come, they were missing. US was also very disappointed. But I think the turning point, would you agree the turning point in US-India relationship is started the new clock, and that was the Clinton's visit to you?
Absolutely, absolutely, no doubt about it. And I remember that very much, the May 1998 Pokhran nuclear test. You know, and this was just at the time that Clinton was planning to go to India. Hillary and Chelsea had visited South Asia, including India, and come back with such great stories about their visit to India. Clinton, and now this was in his second term, you know, he was just so enthusiastic about going to India when this Pokhran nuclear test happened. And tell you, it went from like 100 to 0. You know, the Congressional Caucus on India and Indian Americans, Piyush Bhai will remember this very well. You know, people like Ackerman, Gary Ackerman, you know, there were all these great, great friends of India, Frank Pallone, who had started it. You know, there was going to be a congressional reception put together by the Indian American community when this happened. There had been hundreds of RSVPs because all these guys wanted to be there at the reception and to get their picture taken and then to go to the Indian community in their constitutions and say, look, I was there. I spoke about Gandhi. I spoke about the fact that I introduced legislation. I spoke about the fact that, you know, I'm a great supporter. You know, even they hardly did anything. You know, none of those fellows turned up. And that were the times the rabid Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina said, India not only shot itself in the foot, it shot itself in the head. And he's vowed not to let any aid or anything go to India. But I must say, it was the Indian American community that really rallied around. They got around even Jesse Helms and a few others. And then by March 2000, Clinton, and then they had Strobe Talbot, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, who started what they called a strategic dialogue. And that was a memorable trip, I think, where the real transformation of the relationship took place. Absolutely no doubt about it.
Thanks, Aziz, for sharing the story of India abroad. My question, I don't know if this is something that other Asian communities face as well, but at least from where I'm sitting, the internet has kind of blurred all borders. And oftentimes some of these mainstream media platforms are hiring reporters that are not in the United States. However, they've marked a diversity checkbox, and then those reporters are oftentimes reporting on the Indian American experience without really knowing about it.
Absolutely.
And it blurs the line in terms of political dynamics in the home country and the experiences of Indian Americans here. Almost contributing to the othering,
Yes.
Contributing to allegations of dual loyalty. What can we as members of the community do to elevate our voice? Because we've talked a lot about we need to seize the opportunity to tell our stories, but then there's people living in India, say, trying to tell our stories. I was born and raised here.
Absolutely.
When I go to India, I get the, oh, you Americans,
Yeah.
XYZ.
Yeah.
And it's really been frustrating because now our authority to speak is almost questioned because, well, we already have someone of Indian origin
Yes.
speaking, but they're not Indian American.
Yeah.
What would you say to all of
Absolutely, I agree with you. It's very unfortunate that even mainstream, this is one of the very negative impacts and consequences of social media and the internet, etc., even though the internet has been amazing in terms of technology and what it does, you know. I remember writing about the Cray computer, which India was negotiating. It was like filling up one full room. Today, in our iPhone, we can do everything and then some about what. But unfortunately, what has happened is, your point is well taken about social media. They have virtually even these mainstream newspapers, because they are in such competition with social media. Those days, I could wait for a week on my exclusive story. But when digital media began, it was a matter of seconds. I remember when Rediff.com, which was like the America Online and the first internet who came and bought India abroad, I remember when I would file for them, the editor there would say, Aziz, your story hit 10 seconds before the New York Times and the Washington Post. That was what began. And so they have outsourced it to social media and others outside of the country. And those guys are trying to talk about, like you said, about who Indian Americans are, the dual loyalties, etc. And also the fact that when you go and they say, who are you Americans to come and tell us what to do, which is extremely unfortunate, because it's all about likes, page views, etc., which are what leads to additional revenue streams, etc. It's a hard struggle. How do you stop this, And it's not exclusive just to our community. It's exclusive to a lot of issues. Just look at the whole thing about Elon Musk and Twitter and etc. and what's happening. And what a struggle it is. Who knows who paid whom to say what. You have the whistleblower now going and testifying before Congress. Elon Musk having to pay like $1 billion if he didn't agree to the agreement. But now he's having a pretty good case, because there is this whistleblower who has gone and who's talking about what Twitter did in terms of bots and everything else. But it's a long struggle, and this is one of the very negative consequences of social media. I think we just got to be at it. We got to tell people and talk to these people and say, no, what you guys wrote about is not right. There are enough and more experts here in the US as Indian Americans, Asian Americans, who've lived out their experience, who know about what has been going on. But I agree with you, it's a tough struggle, because some of the internecine things, even in our community, are reported negatively, or with one bias or the other, which is not the way the community can grow in terms of unity. We've got to try to clean it up in our own communities before we become a very pan-Asian American kind of community. So I think it's a tough struggle, but all I can say is we got to be at it if we are going to alleviate what the situation is.
Well, I'm follow up her question. That's she asked other community. Actually, as a Chinese American community, we are facing similar issue. Actually, even worse, because then there is a government actively pouring in a lot of money, both from inside China and get on the internet and influence us. As well as a lot of people live here as Asian American or Chinese Americans, but some of the people do have confusion of where their loyalty stands. So they actually actively participate, collaborate with the government, and doing this disinformation, and very harmful for our community and very harmful for our unity.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. There are people who, for their own vested interests, may it be financial, ideological, or whatever, are collaborators with certain things that happen, which is very, very unfortunate. Because when such issues that mostly incorporate foreign policy issues, issues of trade, issues of politics, diplomacy, etc., when that kind of situation arises, it also impacts on domestic issues for us as Americans, as Asian Americans, which really affect us. And so even issues of immigration and things like that, students coming to study here, get contaminated by those issues. And there is this canard which goes around today, trying to say that every Chinese American student is some or other spy for China, which is totally unfortunate. If issues with India boil down to some person saying that Indian American students are spies for the government of India, maybe for their nuclear program or some other program. It tarnishes the image of genuine students who have come here, which is very, very unfortunate. So we've got a lot of issues to fight for. And like I said, and like Meili spoke about in a very eloquent speech today, we have to unite and we have to fight on certain issues which are common to us, because we do have a lot of issues in our own communities where, like for instance, a perfect example is the Jewish American community. The Jewish American community, like all our communities, they fight among themselves, they have got their own groups and everything else. But when it comes to Israel, wow, they are all together. So I think that's one of the unfortunate things, that there can be groups here just for their vested interests or financial interests, which play one side or the other, which can impact on a lot of issues that affect us. Thank you very much.
Aziz.
Thank you.